European history: The Orleans Monarchy in France, 1830–1848. The Orleans Monarchy in France, 1830–1848. When Charles X abdicated and fled to England following the July Revolution of 1830, Louis Philippe was chosen as the next king of France. Confusion surrounded the succession due to the many political pressure groups in the country at the time. The Bonapartists wanted the continuation of Napoleonic changes and had a lot of support in the country. The Royalists were in favour of the grandson of Charles X, Duc de Bordeaux, to continue with the Bourbon line. The Socialists wanted a government that would put the factors of production under state control, while the Republicans wanted a republic to replace a monarchy under the presidency of Lafayette, the 1789 French revolutionary hero. Charles X's grandson was rejected because of his age young and the evils of his grandfather. The creation of a republic was a popular choice amongst the common people of Paris, but was feared by the moderate middle class because it was associated with the reign of terror that France had witnessed from 1790 to 1794 during the reign of the First French Republic. When in this confusion Louis Philippe's name was mentioned, nobody seriously challenged it. He was therefore voted by the majority in the Chamber of Deputies Parliament. Louis Philippe, 1830–1848. Louis Philippe was the son of Philippe Egalité, the Duke of Orleans, a junior branch of the Bourbon family. He was born in 1773 and he was just 16 years when the French Revolution of 1789 broke out. He once belonged to the Jacobins Club and fought in the Revolutionary Wars against Austria from 1790 to 1794. He voted for the death of his cousin Louis Roman XVI in 1793. Later, when he lost favour of the revolutionaries, he fled to Switzerland and later to England. He returned to Paris after the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 and began mixing with people of all classes, especially the middle-class members. This made him a familiar figure in Paris, and the Parisians identified him as an ordinary citizen. He was the first French monarch or king to be elected and was presented to the Chamber of Deputies as a champion of the Revolution. Reasons why Louis Philippe became King of France in 1830. The revolutionary background of Louis Philippe assisted him to rise to power. He actively participated in the 1789 French Revolution. For example, he fought in the Revolutionary Wars from 1790 to 1794, and he went to exile because of the revolution. He even voted for the death of his cousin, Louis Roman XVI, in 1793 because of the king's anti-revolutionary behaviour. This influenced the revolutionaries to support him because they expected him to champion the cause of the 1789 French Revolution. Louis Philippe was opposed to the ideals and practices of the ancient regime. He, for example, showed little interest in the extravagancy of the ultra-royalists, and he disassociated himself from the unrealistic policies of Charles X and Louis Roman XVI. Therefore, he did not believe in the customs and traditions of his ancestors, the royalists. This increased his popularity among the revolutionary Frenchmen who hated the royalists. His friendship with Adolphe Thiers enabled him to come to power in 1830. Adolphe Thiers was the president of the French journalists and had resisted the censorship of the press by Charles X. It was Adolphe Thiers and his colleagues who presented Louis Philippe to the Chamber of Deputies as a European history: The Orleans Monarchy in France, 1830–1848. Harrow's appealing to the Frenchmen to accept Louis Philippe as the next king of France. This, therefore, made Louis Philippe popular among the Frenchmen, which helped him to come to power in 1830. His ordinary social habits enabled him to rise to power. He associated with all people and led a simple kind of life. He mixed freely with all sections of the society and took his children to local schools. This identified him with the common people of Paris and France in general. It therefore earned him the love of the ordinary people who welcomed him as their king in 1830. Louis Philippe supported the interest of middle-class members, the class to which he belonged. He promised to promote their interests like ownership of private property. This enabled him to win the support of the middle-class members. He was therefore elected by the Chamber of Deputies, which was dominated by the middle-class members. The liberal demands of 1830 and the unpopularity of Charles X assisted Louis Philippe to become King of France. Charles X's reign had led to political frustration among the Frenchmen, and the confusion was exploited by Louis Philippe. For example, Charles X had abolished the constitutional charter of 1814 and ruled as a dictator. There was no freedom of the press, association and worship, among others. As a result, the revolutionaries hoped that Louis Philippe was to restore liberalism in France. The fear of republicanism in France benefited Louis Philippe. This fear existed among the members of the wealthy class and the royalists. They feared that if France was made a republic, the Republican government was to take away the right to private ownership of property the same way Robespierre's government behaved in the 1790s. Republicanism was also associated with anarchy or violence, considering the reign of terror that followed the establishment of the First French Republic in 1792. Similarly, there was a possibility of war from the conservative monarchies of Austria and Russia against Republican France. Due to such fears, the wealthy Frenchmen, royalists and Bonapartists supported Louis-Philippe to come to power in 1830. The royalist background of Louis-Philippe assisted him to come to power in 1830. Louis-Philippe was born in a royal family, i.e. the Orleans family, which was a junior branch to the Bourbon family in France. He therefore had a true hereditary claim to the throne, being a member of the aristocrats. The royalists therefore readily accepted him, hoping that he would maintain their privileges and keep the status of the monarchy. The association of Louis-Philippe with veteran General Lafayette also assisted him to be accepted as King of France. General Lafayette had served in the American War of Independence, and he influenced the Frenchmen to revolt against the ancient regime so as to attain constitutional governance, as was the case in America. On their first meeting in public, Louis-Philippe accepted and received the tricolour flag, which was the symbol of the French Revolution of 1789 from General Lafayette. Therefore, Louis-Philippe was seen as a king who was to promote the revolutionary goals. The success of the 1830 revolution in France assisted Louis-Philippe to come to power. That revolution marked the end of Charles X, and as a result the revolutionaries declared the throne vacant and organised elections for a new king. Therefore, the political vacuum created by the July 1830 revolution enabled Louis-Philippe to come to power in 1830. Louis-Philippe accepted to rule as a constitutional monarch or king, and that is why he was accepted. European history: the Orleans monarchy in France, 1813–1848. The Frenchmen therefore expected Louis-Philippe to restore constitutional governance, which had been removed by Charles X. Louis-Philippe himself wrote books suggesting solutions to the problems of France at the time, and hence many saw him as a man of vision. Social problems like unemployment, poverty and food shortages were reflected in his writings. The writings made him popular among many Frenchmen. The domestic or internal policy achievements at home: Louis-Philippe reigned under very difficult circumstances. The French society was divided into the socialists, Bonapartists, royalists, liberals and republicans, who expected him to pursue the 1830 revolution further. Louis had to deal with all these groups. During his 18 years reign, 1830–1848, he tried in many ways to balance the interests of the above groups. In spite of this, his reign has been described by historians as the 18 years of total disappointment. Louis-Philippe faced growing opposition from almost all political groups in France. Amidst the opposition, the following achievements of Louis-Philippe can be noted. Louis-Philippe promoted constitutional rule in France. In August 1830, Louis-Philippe accepted the title King of the French to the citizen king or a constitutional monarch king, so as to change the former attitude the French had about their kings, who used to practice absolute or bad rule or monarchism. He therefore accepted to rule with the revised constitutional charter of 1830 that restricted his powers, including the right to suspend laws and to rule by decrees or orders. This charter maintained a parliamentary system of government, with the parliament consisting of the Chamber of Deputies and the Chamber of Peers. This is what the liberals and revolutionaries had yearned for by 1830, and therefore it made him popular. The revised 1830 constitutional charter also led to the abolition of the press censorship, which restored freedom of the press in France. This made the Frenchmen happy, especially the liberal journalists who had fought against press censorship by Charles X. Through the same constitutional charter, the electoral system was also revised to widen the franchise. This was through lowering the tax qualification and voting age. To qualify as a voter for the members of the Assembly or Parliament, the Frenchmen now had to pay 200 francs per year in direct taxation, as opposed to 300 francs under the Bourbons. As a result, the number of those who qualified to vote was increased from 94,000 to almost 170,000 people. This made Philippe's regime more representative and democratic than that of the restored Bourbon rulers, and ensured its survival until 1848. Louis-Philippe protected the gains or achievements of the French Revolution of 1789. For example, he adopted the revolutionary tricolour flag as the flag of France. He also restored the National Guard Revolutionary Army, as well as land ownership by the peasants, which the restored Bourbons had abolished. Such attempts also made the Frenchmen happy, especially the revolutionaries who had been annoyed during Charles X's regime. Louis-Philippe also restored religious tolerance or freedom in France. Although Catholicism was Recognized as the state religion, Louis Philippe allowed other religions to operate. In addition, the church influence in state matters was reduced as the church became a subject of the state. Such changes were generally fair, and therefore they made Louis Philippe's regime popular among some. European history. The Orleans Monarchy in France, 1830–1848. Lighting his own study fire, shaving himself, living principally on soup and moving round the shops, with no greater protection than an umbrella. This lifestyle saved state funds and helped France to avoid a financial crisis, and therefore it made many people happy in the first days of Louis Philippe's reign. Louis Philippe carried out several economic reforms in France which helped to create a strong economy. For example, his government attempted to improve workers' conditions through the passing of the Factory Act of 1841. Consequently, by 1843 there was a uniform scale of wages for the workers in France. This also made the regime popular among some Frenchmen. Similarly, Louis Philippe promoted industrialization in France. Several industries were set up, especially wine, coal, textile and iron industries. These local industries were protected from foreign competition by charging high import tariffs so as to compete favorably with England. These industries provided employment opportunities to the Frenchmen, thus addressing the problem of unemployment in addition to raising state revenue and strengthening the economy. Louis Philippe's regime also modernized the transport and communication sector in France, especially railway transport. France had the first railway network established during this time. This eased the movement of goods, which promoted internal and external trade and brought about general prosperity for the country. The railway network connected the different towns of France and made transport cheaper and easier. It also boosted the industrialization drive in the country, especially in carrying bulky goods. Roads and other communication systems were also improved. His regime promoted urbanization in France. Louis Philippe expanded and developed a number of towns. Similarly, industrialization encouraged the growth of towns due to the general increase in the population. For example, Paris, Lyon and Marseille more than doubled in population. Paris, the capital, was furnished with smart shops and buildings to entertain the visiting dignitaries. This satisfied the glory seekers for the meantime. Louis Philippe promoted internal peace and stability in France with no major revolution breaking out in France until 1848. This was done by suppressing internal uprisings that broke out against his regime, especially in the 1830s. He attempted to promote reconciliation with the Bonapartists. For example, as a way of pleasing the Bonapartists, the Napoleonic flag was raised while the body of Napoleon I was exhumed from St. Helena returned to France in 1841 for the official state burial. Similarly, a monument the Arc to Triumph initiated by Napoleon I in commemoration of the great emperor's achievements was completed by Louis Philippe. But the attempts were considered inadequate by the Bonapartists because they were not accompanied by the foreign glory that France boasted of during Napoleon I's time. They therefore remained a serious threat to Philippe's reign until his downfall in 1848. Louis Philippe's government promoted education in France. For example, through the Minister of Public Instruction and Cults known as Francois Guizot, the government passed a comprehensive law on primary education in June 1833. This law led to the establishment of an elementary and primary school in every commune of over 6,000 inhabitants, thus promoting primary education. Teacher training colleges were also established. This made the regime popular among those French men who benefited from such educational reforms. European history. The Orleans Monarchy in France, 1830–1848. The regime of Louis Philippe was characterized by a number of failures which significantly contributed to its downfall in 1848. The following were the main failures of the regime. The regime was dominated by the minority conservative middle-class members bourgeois at the expense of the ordinary Frenchmen peasants. This class was composed of the manufacturers, bankers, lawyers, journalists and university teachers. This was a small section of the entire population of France. Besides, they were rigidly opposed to any reform in line with democracy. Most of his chief ministers, such as Adolphe Thiers and Francois Guizot, were from this class. He completely ignored other classes, especially the poor, yet they were the ones who had brought his regime to power in 1830. Consequently, the poor Frenchmen organized themselves again to overthrow Louis Philippe in 1848. His regime was characterized by corruption or embezzlement and bribery promoted by the chief minister Francois Guizot. For example, Francois Guizot maintained himself in power by a system of bribery and corruption. Though he was supported throughout the years 1840–1848 by a parliamentary majority, he was hated and opposed by most people in the country. This was because he was arrogant and insensitive to the needs of the poor. As a result, he encouraged bribery by distributing government posts, pensions, and business contracts among the members of parliament in order to win their support towards his policies. This behavior of Francois Guizot therefore made the Orleans monarchy under Louis Philippe unpopular. The regime of Louis Philippe restricted the right to vote or franchise. Still less than 3% of the adult Frenchmen, about 200,000 out of 35 million people, were entitled to participate in national elections. The masses believed that if the franchise was widened to include at least all the Frenchmen, their views would be represented in the parliament. Unfortunately, all efforts put into bring about electoral reforms by constitutional means were rejected by the bourgeoisie who dominated Louis Philippe's government. Louis Philippe and his chief minister Guizot refused to put in place electoral reforms, and instead Guizot's answer to those who wanted an extension of the franchise was get rich and qualify to vote automatically. This greatly annoyed the Frenchmen, especially the liberals. Louis Philippe failed to carry out reforms in the army. Although he restored the National Guard that had been disbanded by Charles X, Louis Philippe ignored the cries of the army. As a result, the French army had many grievances against the government. This explains why this army National Guard turned against the Orleans monarchy in 1848 and supported rebels, which led to the overthrow of Louis Philippe. He failed to address the 1846-1848 economic hardships or problems. For example, despite industrial development in France, unemployment increased during the regime of Louis Philippe. This caused general discontent among the unemployed people, and it became easy for them to stage a revolution in 1848, which led to the overthrow of the Orleans monarchy. Similarly, the government of Louis Philippe failed to solve the problem of famine. In 1846-1847, France was hit by bad weather in form of severe winter, which led to poor crop harvests. The government did not have enough food resources in storage, neither did it have money to purchase the food from elsewhere. The poor classes were hit harder by this development. It therefore eroded European history. The Orleans monarchy in France, 1830-1848. Both Louis Philippe and his chief minister Francois Guizot completely failed to improve the living conditions of France's poorer classes. Instead, the government promoted prosperity amidst widespread poverty of the masses. For example, while industrialization benefited the middle class and fostered national growth, it exposed the workers to poor working conditions in the factories. Many workers were residing in slums, received low wages, worked for very long hours, and most of them failed to acquire private property. As a result, the wealthy middle class, the bankers and industrialists, were prospering greatly while the poor were getting poorer. This poverty eventually contributed to the outbreak of the 1848 revolution, which overthrew Louis Philippe. Industrial conflicts increased during the regime of Louis Philippe. There were many strikes by the industrial workers and the formation of trade unions to express discontent. In 1831, Republican and other forms of demonstrations broke out in Paris, Lyon, and other parts of the country. The reaction by the government was to break up strikes by bloodshed, suppress trade unions and political clubs, and ignore the ever-increasing demand for an extension of the franchise. This increased discontent among the Frenchmen, which eventually contributed to the collapse of the Orleans monarchy. The return of Napoleon's remains in 1841 for state burial by Louis Philippe had negative implications. For example, it led to the rise of Bonapartism in France, which undermined the survival of the Orleans monarchy. Bonapartism was the belief in the restoration of Napoleon's glory. The Bonaparte supporters increased in numbers year after year, led by a nephew to the emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte, who promised to restore the former glory of Napoleon I. Louis Philippe failed to satisfy these people. When he returned Napoleon's body in 1841, the Bonapartists were provoked to ask for more, especially in the field of foreign glory where Louis Philippe had failed. As a result, they demanded for the downfall of Louis Philippe so as to re-establish the Napoleonic France. This eventually contributed to the outbreak of the 1848 revolution in France, which overthrew the Orleans monarchy. The regime was hated for its harsh reaction towards the opposition. Louis Philippe resorted to political repression or harassment, which further annoyed the Frenchmen. In April 1834, for example, there was opposition in Parliament over a new electoral law restricting the right of association among the parliamentarians. This caused civil unrest, and the brutal response by the regime led to the death of many Frenchmen. Louis Philippe later promoted dictatorship, which generated discontent that overthrew him. For example, he rigidly censored the press through the introduction of new press laws in 1832, 1833. 1834 and 1835, contrary to the 1830 constitutional charter that had put an end to press censorship. These laws made it difficult for opposition newspapers to operate without facing fines, confiscations, and even prison terms. Some Republican newspapers were forced to close down. This earned him opposition from the liberal journalists. Further still, he imposed a law of discussion in 1835 by which the Frenchmen were not to discuss any other political party except the one in power. He even restricted the freedom of association amongst the Frenchmen through passing the law of associations, by which heavy penalties were imposed for forming societies aimed at overthrowing the government. This annoyed the Frenchmen, especially the liberals. European history: the Orleans Monarchy in France, 1830–1848. Employer. However, Louis Philippe feared annoying his friends, the rich middle class, with any plan of confiscating their wealth. This therefore isolated him from the poor, who in big numbers supported socialism to overthrow Louis Philippe in 1848. Louis Philippe failed to restore the full political influence of the Catholic Church in the state affairs, which was demanded by a section of the Catholics in France. Charles X had revived the powers of the Catholic Church in the state affairs, for example, the control of the education system, which was reversed by Louis Philippe. This made him unpopular among the Catholics of France. Louis Philippe failed to satisfy the interests of the Republicans, and this became a major challenge to his regime. Led by Lamartine, the Republicans demanded for the establishment of a republic because the monarchy had failed to deliver for the second time. They also demanded for parliamentary reforms and widening of the franchise. Louis Philippe failed to control their increasing numbers as well as implementing their demands. This undermined the popularity of the Orleans monarchy, which eventually contributed to the collapse of the monarchy in 1848. Louis Philippe's foreign policy, 1830–1848. To many Frenchmen, the French foreign policy between 1838 and 1848 was generally a failure on grounds that their aspirations were not fulfilled. By tradition, the Frenchmen were used glories of military conquest, and their country posed as a great power in Europe, especially during Napoleon's reign. However, France was humbled and humiliated following the defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815. The glory seekers therefore needed the revival of such glory, while the liberals wanted France to help the oppressed nationalities in Europe, such as the Belgians, Poles, and Italians, to get their freedom and independence. Such interests required a vigorous foreign military policy that would lead France into war with other countries. On the contrary, Louis Philippe pursued a peaceful policy with the rest of Europe for fear of losing his newly won throne. He had not secured the support of the hereditary monarchies of Europe, and therefore his survival depended on a successful publicity campaign and cooperation with Europe, or else the European powers would unite and restore Charles X to the throne. As a result, his conduct in the foreign affairs was restrained, and France posed no danger to international peace and stability. To some extent, this was an achievement in the foreign policy of Louis Philippe. He improved the commercial and trade relations between France and Britain, and never did he assert France as a continental power. A free trade treaty was signed with Britain in 1840 to expand trade and consolidate international relations. This enabled France to secure the support of Britain and other great powers like Austria, Russia, and Prussia, and to also maintain general peace in Europe. This sustained his regime for 18 years. In spite of the above achievements, the peaceful foreign policy of Louis Philippe greatly damaged his image in France. He failed to satisfy the interests of the nationalist glory seekers and liberals, and this therefore contributed to his downfall in 1848. The following were the major events in French foreign policy of Louis Philippe during the period 1830–1848. The Belgian Revolution of 1830. The Belgian Revolution of 1830 undermined the popularity of King Louis Philippe. The French people, especially the Bonapartists, liberals, Catholics, and nationalists, wanted Louis Philippe to assist the European history: the Orleans Monarchy in France, 1830–1848. The British candidate, Leopold of Saxe-Coburg, who was related to Queen Victoria, instead took over the throne. There was therefore a general feeling in France that the king was coward and weak, and worked to serve the interests of Britain. This greatly reduced his popularity at home. Later in 1831, when the Dutch troops attacked Belgium, the Allied powers selected Louis Philippe to defend Belgium. This he did successfully, and was thus able to claim part of his lost reputation that France had supported the Belgian independence. But even then, his rule was restricted by Britain, thus undermining the position of France as a great power. Eventually, the matter of the Belgian independence was settled by the London Treaty of 1839 and was accepted by the Dutch king, but had significantly weakened the Orleans monarchy. The Polish Revolution of 1830. The Polish Revolution of 1830 also undermined the credibility of the regime. In 1830, the Bonapartists and Catholics appealed to the king to intervene in Poland and save their fellow Catholics from the Russian control and brutality, as they had staged a nationalistic revolution against Russia. Louis-Philippe feared the possibility of Russia, Austria and Prussia declaring war against France, since all these countries had Polish nationals. He therefore refused to assist the Catholics in Poland. The Italian revolutions of 1830. This was another event which undermined the regime of Louis-Philippe. In 1830, the Italians staged nationalistic revolutions against Austria, and the French Catholics and Bonapartists wanted Louis-Philippe to save the fellow Catholics from Austrian oppression. Louis-Philippe declined and was labelled as a very weak king not interested in promoting the French glory abroad. The events in Spain and Portugal of 1834. In 1834, a quadruple alliance of Britain, Portugal, Spain and France was able to bring the liberal forces to power in Spain and Portugal by overthrowing the despot absolutes. But this did not please the liberals at home, because Louis-Philippe was only acting as a liberal outside but a conservative at home. France. The Spanish marriages of 1846. In 1846, the Spanish marriages brought further trouble for Louis-Philippe. Both the Queen of Spain, Isabella, and her young sister Infanta were unmarried. France and Britain eagerly presented candidates, for the successful candidate would mean prestige and international fame for that particular country where he came from. England supported the German prince, the Duke of Cadiz, who was related to Queen Victoria, while Louis-Philippe presented his younger son Duc de Montpensier. Because of the conflicting interests, a compromise was finally reached that the Queen marries a British candidate rumoured to be impotent, and the Queen's sister marries Louis-Philippe's son, but only after the heir to the throne was born by the Queen. This was accepted by both Guizot and Louis-Philippe, but of course this was again to the advantage of Britain. Realising their mistake, Guizot and Louis-Philippe secretly arranged the marriages of the Spanish ladies on the same day, contrary to the initial understanding. This double-minded behaviour of Louis-Philippe annoyed Britain and the Frenchmen in equal measure. Britain had for many years prevented such closeness of France to Spain because of its proximity to the Mediterranean Sea. This was the gateway to the British commercial empire in the Far East. As a result, the Anglo-French relations. European history. The Orleans Monarchy in France, 1830–1848. Class members who used to trade with Britain, and therefore they abandoned Louis-Philippe's regime, which eventually contributed to its collapse in 1848. The Syrian question, 1831–1841. Louis-Philippe's involvement in the Syrian crisis, part of the Turkish Empire, shamed France and damaged his reputation. War broke out in 1831 between Mehmet Ali of Egypt and the Sultan of Turkey Muhammad Roman II, who should rule Syria. Britain and Russia rapidly supported the Sultan of Turkey, while Louis-Philippe of France supported Egypt due to public opinion. Britain worked with Russia to defeat the Egyptians. At the height of the crisis, France was isolated by the great powers who organised the 1840 London Conference to discuss the Syrian question without France as the enemy. Louis-Philippe, realising danger, withdrew the support to Mehmet Ali of Egypt, and he was unable to defend the French interests in the Middle East. Adolphe Thiers, the Prime Minister, wanted to go ahead with the venture, but Louis-Philippe, a cautious man, refused and ordered the French troops to withdraw from Egypt to avert war with Britain. Consequently, Adolphe Thiers resigned in 1840 and was replaced by Francois Guizot, who pressed for peace. The Frenchman was severely hurt, especially the glory seekers and nationalists, who therefore criticised Louis-Philippe for his failure to promote the French glory abroad. The Tahiti Island issue. Between 1843 and 1844, the French friendship of Britain was threatened with matters concerning the island of Tahiti in South Pacific, claimed by both England and France. The French had previously forced the British out of this island, and it was annexed to France. However, during the regime of Louis-Philippe, Britain warned France that war was likely to happen over the control of this island. Consequently, Louis-Philippe returned the island to Britain. This humiliated the French, who hated Louis-Philippe and Guizot's submission to Britain. The Swiss Civil War of 1846. In 1846, a civil war broke out in Switzerland between the conservative Catholics and the Protestant liberals. Britain secretly supported the Protestants, but France feared helping the Catholics. Louis-Philippe feared to annoy Britain and the liberals at home. The Catholics of France condemned Louis-Philippe's government for failing to help fellow Catholics, while the nationalists were annoyed by Louis-Philippe's peaceful foreign policy. The Algerian venture or project. This is the only area where Louis-Philippe scored some success in the foreign policy. The project began during Charles X's reign. When Louis-Philippe came to power, he consolidated or strengthened the French control over Algeria by suppressing an armed resistance against the French rule there. Consequently, he encouraged steady colonization of Algeria, and by 1847 around 50,000 French citizens had established themselves in Algeria. This project pleased the French glory seekers, though it was very expensive as it costed France a lot of money and lives, which also damaged the reputation of the Orleans monarchy. By 1847, therefore, Louis-Philippe was doing badly in foreign affairs. The regime was generally peaceful with the rest of Europe and served the interests of Britain, but this was contrary to the European history. The Orleans monarchy in France, 1830–1848.